a lot of time, please feel free to start and then just to explain what you had to do on either BTS or Harry Potter or whatever you feel like talking. Today's a special day at the university, so it's just like a happy, feasty day. Enjoy.
Sounds great. Someone's got to let me share my screen so I can pull up my PowerPoint. It seems to be currently disabled.
I don't know where Anna is. Can you please? Yes.
I didn't listen. What do you want?
I need
to share the screen.
Oh, okay. It's ready.
Okay, let's see. Give me a second. All right, here we go. Don't know why it's not offering that as an option, but let's see what happens. Let's get rid of this. Okay, what are you seeing now? Are you starting to see the slide deck?
Actually, we saw your email account.
Yeah, probably not such a good thing to share, but here we go.
But not the slides, unfortunately.
Okay, so I'm trying to get to the top of them. Here we go. And let's try this again. Okay, let's see. Share screen. There we go. All right, now you can see the screen.
Now we can see.
Go up one
Thank you.
level and do this. Okay, well, I am very honored to be here today and very excited to be sharing this with you. This is a new presentation I pulled together specifically for this talk and reflects the latest of our thinking on a topic that I've kept circling around for a good chunk of my career. I think I first began writing about fandom and to some degree fan activism back 30 plus years ago when I was in grad school, and it keeps coming back. But it's come back with a vengeance with the latest 3 books that I've been involved with. By Any Media Necessary, The New Youth Activist was followed by Pop Culture and the Civic Imagination, Case Studies of Creative Social Change. And most recently, I wrote Introduction/Forward for Practicing Futures, a Civic Imagination Action Handbook for Gabriel Peters Lazaro and Sangeeta Shrestova, who are my research collaborators. So I'm going to draw on that today, but push us in some new directions, and I'm still trying to think through. So there's been a lot of talk around the world in the last few years about the face of the young activist. So many of the social movements around the world that matter today have been driven by young activists. And we've seen covers of Time and other news magazines really focus on trying to understand who this person is, both in the American context for us in the US, but globally as well. And Greta may be the kind of emblematic example of a young activist who's grabbed the attention of the world on questions of the environment. This is an interesting portrait of young activists. These are Korean or K-pop fans in Seoul. We can see sort of certain fan iconography there. We see signage. It looks just like a protest march. In fact, it's a fan rally, but it could well have been, given the way the BTS army now functions as a cultural movement and as something of a political movement. We first became aware of the political effect of the BTS army when a Trump rally in Oklahoma in 2020 was effectively disrupted by K-pop fans on TikTok. Right? They were able to register massive numbers of people to attend this rally. It forced the Trump people to expand their space and to start making bold announcements about how many people were going to turn out, all of which left them with a half-empty arena and a lot of egg on their face as far as the media was concerned. And so that was the beginning of it. Since then, we've seen the BTS itself come out in support of Black Lives Matter, and fans of BTS do things like disrupt police intelligence attempts to identify protesters at Black Lives Matter protest around the country. So I am not an expert on K-pop or its fans, but in my research group, we've spent a fair amount of time talking through this example, trying to understand what it might have to teach us. The first starting point for understanding is to recognize the global impact of all of the Korean pop culture industries, right? Film in the case of Parasite, television in the case of Squid Games, and a number of subsequent K-dramas, which have had global impact. At its peak, Squid Games had popularity in 60 countries around the world simultaneously as the #1 Netflix streaming event content. And finally, the K-pop movement, its music itself, right? So there's, first of all, a cultural pertinence to K-pop that is to some degree generational. You know, I think there is if I talk to my students, particularly my undergraduates, Korean pop culture is the thing. The way as when I was in grad school, Hong Kong action films with John Woo and Jackie Chan and Michelle Yeoh, and, you know, go down the list, were the thing that we were paying attention to globally. And I see that Hong Kong moment as the beginning of a move toward what I call pop cosmopolitanism. The idea that young people around the planet are seeking to escape the parochialism of their own culture by embracing pop culture elsewhere. It's a cosmopolitanism not founded in opera or art cinema, but in popular culture. So the cultural dimension's important, but it's not the only thing going on here, because fandom creates a social infrastructure, a set of connections, a network of people who feel commonality with each other and who have communication channels that are active and information is flowing through them. And that social infrastructure, the army of the BTS army, is an important thing which allows rapid mobilization at the current moment. Third, there's a technical capacity. Keep in mind that K-pop depends on reality shows in South Korea, where much like American Idol or Pop Idol, where people vote and those votes are, you know, organized. So, and there's a constant jockeying of the idols for positions on charts, which require these fans to continually register through social networking technologies and practices. So there's an enormous knowledge within the K-pop fan community about how to deal with registration systems. And so it's no accident that many of the cases we know of K-pop fan activism center around registration, like the Trump rally itself. That ability to register large numbers of people and manipulate algorithmic systems is something very deeply known within this community. And finally, and maybe the key catalyst here, is there's a political and racial consciousness in the K-pop fan community, because K-pop performers were appropriating things like Black hairstyles. And Black K-pop fans in the United States, particularly Black women, were using podcasts, were using video sharing to comment on this, to debate and engage in debates with Korean fans about these practices and educate them about the politics of cultural appropriation, which meant this was a community globally that was particularly aware of American racial, political, cultural issues. And so when Black Lives Matter launched over the George Floyd death, again, relaunched over the George Floyd death, there was an awareness, a knowledge that could be built on for rapid mobilization, right? So put that together and you have a powerful system for social change. Let's consider a more recent and more mundane example, but one that I think demonstrates the power. So the Academy Award is struggled with how to recognize popular films as its ratings dwindles. And so this go around, they tried this thing of hashtag Oscar fan favorite, using Twitter to register the popularity of various recent films with the audience. And their assumption was something like Spider-Man No Way Home, last year's most commercially successful film, would rise to the top of this vote. Anyone who knows how the internet works would have told them that was not what was going to happen. Indeed, I was telling some Oscar voters and committee members from the moment it was announced that what I thought was going to happen, some of which is what happened, some of which I was surprised by, but there was something curious occurs. So the #1 ranked film was not Spider-Man, but one of the recent films of Zack Snyder's City of the Dead. And Zack Snyder already had a highly trained, highly mobilized fan base because they had been campaigning for the release of the Snyder Cut of Justice League, the Snyder Cut being his cut before he was removed from this production. And HBO Max last year released that on, made it available to people, an extended version of that film. So it's no accident that Zack Snyder's fan base is highly motivated, highly mobilized, and won essentially both of the fan vote categories for the Academy Award. Underneath that, though, curiously, is a film that's never been released, that no one's seen, or very few people have seen, a film called Minamata, which when I saw it flash on the screen, there was this, what the fuck? I have no idea what this film is, but I looked it up. It's a film about an activist photographer dealing with chemical mercury poisoning in Japan. So there's an activist angle to it. There's a cultural angle to it, and about it being about Japan. But the key factor is it stars Johnny Depp. And Johnny Depp is a star who's been to some degree canceled because of charges against him in his divorce battle with Amber Heard, but who has a strong base of support from particularly conservatives who are anti-cancel culture, right? So there's this kind of weird thing going on where the film is progressive, the politics around Johnny Depp is conservative, and the two came together to make fan mobilization around it possible. The third was what I had expected to happen, which was a vote for the worst campaign. Because anytime that we see audience given the chance to choose something, their first move is to try to negate the logic of the category itself, to make the institution act against its own interest in a way to see just how much power the audience has. And this go around, Vote for the Worst coalesced around Amazon's Cinderella film. And you could watch online if you follow the discussions, deciding what was the worst film of the year, so that people that had enough visibility that people knew what it was and have an impact if it was announced at the Oscars. And so it was pushed to the third place, right? Cinderella was third place on this. Fourth place was Spider-Man. And in fifth place was Tick, Tick, Boom, which I see as the muscle flexing of Broadway fans, musical fans, which is another huge online fan base. So when you think about it, here's a powerful institution with a global reach that was disrupted not once, but 4 times by different mobilized fan activist groups pushing to get their stuff visible in an internet-based networked competition. And I think that's really interesting. Now, the Oscars just rushed through it on a night that's always going to be remembered as the night of the slap, but there were a lot of other interesting things going on that night, and this was one of them. But if we look at that alongside what's happening with young activists, this power to mobilize quickly and effectively to challenge and disrupt powerful institutions is the same power that March for Our Lives, the anti-gun violence movement in the United States, has been able to deploy. So Parkland High School, site of school shooting. In the past, those students would have been talked about, like Sandy Hook was, but these students wanted to grab the voice themselves, take advantage of the visibility they had to speak out against gun violence. And within like a 5-week period, they went from giving talks at high school assemblies to having this massive rally on Washington, D.C., in which they were speaking on national television, live broadcast on CNN. Right? They have since gone on to change 150 local and state gun laws in the United States. They have been an extraordinarily effective movement on an issue that many people thought was just stagnant, that nothing was going to move on. And it was their ability to use a variety of media to speak out and their ability to mobilize quickly and effectively through social networking technologies, which made it possible for them to do that. And I want to suggest that there's a very thin line between disrupting the Oscars and taking on and bankrupting the National Rifle Association, right? But the fan activists who can mobilize have had to identify a topic where they think change is possible, identify the decision makers who could make a difference, identifying ways to mobilize a large group of people, educate those people, give them something to do, and mobilize them into action. That's all of the basic components of a social change campaign. So if it's whether it's directed at releasing the Snyder Cut or whether it's directed at gun violence, it's more or less the same set of activities that are there. So the skill sets are there as latent potential within these fan communities. And we've seen a long history of people trying to change television text as a way of pursuing cultural and political identity. So 25 years ago, I wrote a case study of the Galactic Network, a gay, lesbian, bi, trans community that wanted to see queer characters on Star Trek. And we now have seen a whole succession of queer characters on Star Trek that have come together, that have made that a central part of the vision of Star Trek. Although it took longer than anyone expected for the process to start, it has become central to the way Star Trek operates. Now, if we think about it, cancel culture itself represents the power to negate, as I call it, of communities, of fans and anti-fans working to reshape the culture. It's a complex phenomenon, right? On the one hand, it is the public holding people who are too powerful and have gotten away with things for a long time to account, the only way they can, by publicly shaming them, right? So going after Harvey Weinstein for sexual harassment and sexual assault through social media is really powerful. It also becomes a kind of mob rule in the wrong hands at the wrong moment, which disrupts the system and can be unduly punitive for mistakes, for certain kinds of mistakes. It can be misdirected, and that's why it's become such an important debate in the United States. The striking thing is that cancel culture is often led by fans who are disillusioned or angry at the behavior of celebrities and discovering something's going on with people they care about, that they call attention to it. And so I do see it as a kind of fan activism, although a multivalent or one that we have some ambivalence about. Another form that fan activism could take is what Adrian Martin Jr. calls mandatory or compulsory fandom, where fans of color are mobilized to support any commercial release that includes, say, Black representation, so that they can ensure that Hollywood continues to make them, right? And so there's a kind of coercive effect Martin is suggesting for these fans, but there is also a celebratory effect. The single man at the bottom there is Terry Marshall. He's a fan, he's an activist on a number of issues, among them Black Lives Matter. And he saw a moment with the release of the Black Panther film to have WakandaCon, which would be the first fan convention for people of color in the United States. Most fan conventions, people of color are kind of marginalized, they're minoritized. Here, it was a space where Black fans in particular could come together, and it was a site of cultural and political mobilization. It's part of a growing interest in Afrofuturism, which had been mounting prior to the release of Black Panther. But Black Panther sort of has created a space, a kind of Black cultural renaissance around imagining futures of Blackness. And it also is part of a larger pattern of activism around the film. The organization Define American, which is an immigrant rights organization, developed with Fandom Forward a study guide for thinking about Black Panther through the lens of immigrant and rights. And the Black Lives Matter movement launched Wakanda the Vote a way to get register people to vote at screenings of Black Panther. And so they used Black Panther to identify Black constituencies in the same way that an earlier generation of activists might have registered people at a Black church. Now, Fandom Forward not only made the study guide for Black Panther, but also has made study guides for a range of other fan films tied to social issues, social advocacy issues, activist training, which are used by schools and after-school programs, by activist groups, by NGOs and so forth, to get people mobilized, especially young people, by using their cultural interest as the entry point. Now, Fandom Forward is an offshoot of the Harry Potter Alliance, which has now for 15 years been very effectively organizing, recruiting young activists to participate in the political process. Now, I put up this one, which is actually an early ad for the Harry Potter Alliance. No one should be forced to live in the cupboard, as a reminder that many of these fan activists were queer activists, very strongly. One of the more important ones, Jackson Bird, who was one of the leaders of the Harry Potter Alliance, is now a trans activist, wrote a book called Sorted about that journey, the journey he went on. All of whom were very deeply upset by J.K. Rowling's comments about trans through social media. And there's been a lot of soul searching or struggling within this organization where the Harry Potter books and characters help them find their own sexual and gender identities, whereas the writer has been fairly hateful in some of the things that she said about some of those same identities. So how do they proceed with this mythology, given the failure of the writer to live up to the values of her own story? What we see, the Harry Potter Alliance is about registering people to vote, using the infrastructure of fandom, whether it's Wizard Rock concerts or Quidditch games or Yuletide parties, the use of blogs and podcasts, but in that fan community. It really is the original model for what fan activism can look like. And it's changing the face of who shows up at protest marches. These are two photos taken at the Women's March in Washington following Trump's inauguration, using the Harry Potter imagery to participate in the protest. And indeed, if we look at protest marches around the country, around the world, we're increasingly seeing what feels like cosplay. So the Hunger Game, Handmaid's Tale iconography is being used increasingly at reproductive rights and women's rights protest around the country and around the world. This is a photograph taken at the Women's March in Washington. First, we see the pink pussy hats, which were a folk project from Etsy. Then we see History Has Its Eyes on You, which is a slogan from the Broadway musical Hamilton. And over that is the eyes and hair buns of Princess Leia, who was used widely in the iconography of the Women's March as a symbol for female leadership of resistance movements, right? And it happened, that march happened not long after Carrie Fisher died, not long after she appeared in Last Jedi. All of that stuff came together to make her an important symbol of women's rights in the United States. With the immigrant rights movement, we see the use of superheroes, right? And particularly Superman, to think about what it is to struggle for immigrant rights within the United States. And the Dreamer used Superman to tell their story, right? They would say there's no such thing as an illegal alien, that they're undocumented people, but aliens come from outer space. But that tells us that if there were an illegal alien, it might well be Kal-El from the planet Krypton, whose parents sent him away in search of a better life, who enters the country illegally, crosses over the border in the middle of the night, lands in the cornfields of Kansas, is picked up by an Anglo couple who teaches them to hide who he is and where he came from. and nevertheless goes out and fight for truth, justice, and the American way of life while wearing his ethnic garb, i.e. the Superman costume is made from the blankets his mother wrapped him in and sent him away to the new world. And that S, according to the most recent version, is not an S, but it's a piece of the kryptonite alphabet. So he really is an ethnic hero, who in one of the recent films is asked where he comes from, and he says, "I was raised in Kansas. You can't get more American than that." And that's shifting the question from where he comes from to where he was raised is part of the whole messaging of the Dreamer movement. Now, when Dreamers grab hold of Superman, they're actually reaching back to the past. The story was created by two Eastern European immigrants, Jewish immigrants, refugees from Hitler, who created the symbol as a way of standing up to the Nazis. So when we look at it, we're seeing one generation of immigrant advocates speaking across a 7-year span to another. And that's really an interesting phenomenon, the power of pop culture symbols to persist and be relevant across that span of time. All right, but it's global now at this point. These are Thai students using the three-finger salute from Hunger Games to stand up to a militia while advocating for economic rights. These are Palestinians marching through what they call the occupied territory, like Navi from James Cameron's Avatar, chanting, "Sky people, you can't take our lands." And this is footage, this big image here is the streets of Hong Kong, where student protesters are singing, "Can you hear the people singing" from Les Mis, a revolutionary song based on from a West End musical based on a French novel, which they know through the cast recording album of the Broadway cast, that is turned into an anthem for democracy in Hong Kong. So pop culture, again, layer after layer after layer of pop culture is leading to this. Now, we could describe this as meme-based politics, right? And it is to some degree. Memes are about finding the most effective visual to communicate a particular message in a way that's easily grasped and transmitted through social networks. I used to call them people's editorial cartoons, right? They have the same effect of an editorial cartoon of encapsulating an issue, but they're done in a more open-ended way where people are in a participatory culture building on each other's imagery and ideas and circulating it along through the circuits. We might also think of it as hashtags in relation to hashtag movements, right? And these are just some examples of very effective hashtag movements, from Ferguson to the Umbrella Revolution to the Ice Bucket Challenge, massive mobilizations around the use of hashtags. Think about Black Lives Matter, which has focused attention on racialized police violence as systemic racism. Well, any individual incident would have been treated by the local news in the past and would have disappeared after a few days of coverage. But the ability to organize all of those events is to show a pattern by individual people posting news coverage under that hashtag and getting the attention of a national and even global movement around it is something radically different. So when we do a say their names moment at a protest and we're listing all of those names, those are names from local news stories that suddenly form a pattern that we can all see and recognize. And it is the only way really to make systemic racism more visible is to show that it is systemic, to show that it is widespread within the culture rather than the news and police tendency to treat it as an isolated incident. So as we think about these symbols of pop culture, we see that the same symbols, the superhero, for example, can be used by a range of different movements as metaphors to think about their political concerns, their identities to rally behind, their forces to fight against. Here's the white-faced Barack Obama as the Joker from a conservative side, and here is Trump as the Joker, a different Joker, being mobilized by the left. But there is a sense that what we fight against can be visualized through pop culture analogies as well. This is from an art project which uses the artwork of Jack Kirby, the comic book artist, and sort of shows the parallels of Kirby's work to issues within the Black community. So here we see Magneto as Malcolm X, and there's a parallel picture of Dr. Xavier as Martin Luther King, and it sort of is a way of understanding and educating people about divides in the Black civil rights movement as they parallel the debates around mutants and X-Men. This here is a Sikh who in New York City, an activist who dresses like Captain America but wears a turban. And he's particularly targeted the See Something, Say Something campaign on the New York subway, which is intended to get people to turn in terrorists. There's no signs that it's actually reduced any terrorism. There are plenty of signs that's effective at identifying brown people with backpacks on the New York subway. So the racial profiling of it is what he directs his attention at. And he's such a visible icon that people take pictures with him. They post it on social media. It continually allows the circulation of his message. So he's in some ways a walking, talking meme. Oh, here's a Birdman camp image attacking Trump. Maybe, you know, the irony of this is, of course, in the film, there's this idea that Birdman is a wasted effort, that it's bad Hollywood corruption. But Birdman himself has become a symbol, particularly in Mexico, in memes attacking Trump for his anti-Mexican rhetoric. In the US, Native American artists are using similar kinds of structures to assert their presence for the future, right? It turns out that something like 25% of Americans have no idea that there are still Native Americans alive today, because the imagery they receive is all of Indians attacking cowboys in the 19th century and being shot and killed. So the idea of using images from Star Wars and Star Trek to show the persistence of Native culture in the future has proven to be one of many important tactics for insisting on visibility for a contemporary and future place for Native peoples. Now, some people might call all of what I'm describing as slacktivism. That is the idea that it's easy, it's cheap, there's low risk, all of which is seen as negatives because it also implies lower commitment levels. In fact, in all of the cases I'm looking at, the digital is the tip of a much larger iceberg of actions. It is one tool used among many by these activists, and street mobilizations still persist. Wheat paste and poster boards still persist. Underground comics still persist. This is what we meant in our book by saying by any media necessary, that young people lack access to the AAA game, media in our society, the blockbuster media. So they take advantage of any and all media they can find, from t-shirts to the internet, to fight for social change, to get their messages out. And they have become master technicians, sometimes from their own living room, as we've seen during Zoom, where mobilization is mostly housebound, but nevertheless highly effective at changing things in the culture. So my colleague, Michael Saylor, the historian, talks about fandom as the public sphere of the imagination, a space where debates are framed in and through imaginary works, imaginary worlds, but are debates that are urgent and important as would occur in any other public sphere. So thinking of fandom as the public sphere of the imagination allows us to start to make some sense of what's going on. And that brings us to this idea of the civic imagination, which governs some of my recent work. So we start with, what do we mean by the civic? The civic is cultural and social. It's the foundation to which we return as we seek to resolve disagreements and work through tensions. It's a shared set of norms, values, commitments we make to each other as a member of a community. And it's a capacity to work together toward common goals. So I would argue that participatory culture, broadly defined, is one of those sites where the civic remains alive today, where social connections are formed between individuals, where this kind of extreme individualism we associate with neoliberalism starts to break down in favor of some kinds of communalism. And that fandom is a spectacular example of the civic at work, as we've seen in all of these examples so far. It stands in contrast with the political. The political is more overtly partisan than the civic. It's about struggles over distribution of power and resources. It exists in the space of institutional politics or labor versus management, producers versus consumers, these large-scale categories. Now, historically, Danielle Allen, the political theorist, tells us elections had endings. People resolved their conflicts. There is a process of political reconciliation, no matter how divisive a movement is or how divisive an election is, and people more or less settle back into being neighbors, members of a community. But in America today, and in many other countries around the world, divisions are never healed because it's the interest of political candidates to use wedge issues to sharpen the divides and keep them alive between election cycles so they can easily mobilize them so that they can be effectively weaponized in the next political struggle. And elections have no endings. Legislation is never fully resolved. So the conflicts are kept alive, and that is eating away at the civic foundation of our society. So I'm very interested in how can works of the imagination provide a space where we rebuild the civic, where we feel these connections with each other through shared symbols, myths, rituals, practices that bring us together as a community. So as we think about civic imagination, we want to identify what its core functions are. So before we can create a better world, that is the goal of social change movements, we have to imagine what a better world looks like. And here are two recent examples of better worlds. One is a piece of art from the solar punk movement, which is a science fiction literary movement that is also seeking to materialize what a more sustainable environment might look like. And they're turning toward imageries of greater integration of plants and cities together. The other is Wakanda, which we've referred to earlier. But if you think about Wakanda as a vision of Africa, it turns on its head many of the cliche understandings of Africa or of, quote, developing countries that Americans have produced in the past. First, this high-tech country, right? It's a country that's never been colonized or conquered. It's a country where tribal divisions are fairly easily negotiated around and through. It's a country where women play powerful roles. It's not simply a patriarchy. And it's a country ready to take leadership of the world. It will be Wakanda, the end of the first Black Panther movie, is going to be a global superpower. That's a really exciting image of Africa, and it's expressed through Pan-African imagery, which speaks particularly well to Black Americans. I had one of them say to me that because they know they come from Africa, but their roots were so damaged and destroyed through the process of slavery that they could not tell you which African tribe or nation was their mother country. Africa is the mother country. And so Pan-African imagery speaks to them in a particularly powerful, poignant way about their own identity. So that is a better world for them. Second, you must imagine yourself as a civic agent capable of making change. And here we see Emma Gonzalez from the March for Our Lives movement that I talked about earlier. And next to that, we see one of many imagery around emergency workers during the pandemic, which used the figure of masks and superheroes and linked the two together. And so the sense of the civic age, the emergency worker is a civic agent, a superhero, is a kind of way of using pop culture imagery, civic imagination, to think about the pandemic differently. You need to imagine yourself as part of a community with shared interest. So we're interested both in how people represent their community, the we are the 99% from Occupy Wall Street, and rituals which bring communities together. And here we see Bollywood dance being used for protest in Mumbai, right? And both of those are kind of examples of what political scientists call genres of participation, where we know what to do and where to do it and how to do it, because we're tapping knowledge we have from someplace else. You need to imagine a process of change. Like, what does change look like? What are the mechanisms of change that are likely to yield results? And here we see some examples of Black Lives Matter and Greta, who both have used alternative mechanisms of change to get their messages out and to put pressure on decision makers. And Greta's focus on the UN versus the struggles through the courts by Black Lives Matter are each different tactics for thinking about how to bring about change. You have to forge solidarity with groups whose perspectives are different from your own. And here we see the K-pop fans again, and we can think about the connection between South Korean K-pop fans and Black K-pop fans in the United States, which led to that K-pop fan activism. Or in the US, we have the imagery that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who was a new style, new generation political leader in the US. She's formed alliance with other freshman women of different racial and ethnic backgrounds, which is sometimes called the Squad. Here it's called the Freshman Force, and a comic book series that was produced about their politics and struggle. And so they use politics, they use games to get their message out. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez did a political rally using using the game Twitch, using Twitch to mobilize young voters on the eve of the 2020 election. Her rally had more people at it online than the Trump rallies as an aggregate it had throughout the entire campaign season. Incredibly effective at getting young people to participate. For those who are most oppressed, you have to imagine freedom, dignity, democracy, safety, participation before you can directly experience them. This is an idea from the Black radical imagination. Now, to be clear, often what's used as the example of registering Black people to vote in the South during the Civil Rights Movement, where there was history of risk and danger about registering to vote and no history of payoff. But as people are pointing out to me, things like voting for church leadership inside a Black church gave them an experience of voting and democracy at a small scale. But the next leap of faith is the imagination, which allows you to think about the transformative effects of voting. And they could not have visualized the number of Black elected officials in the South today, often in some of those same districts where they were attacked by police dogs and fire hoses. So right now, in the last couple of years, we've seen real struggles over symbols in the United States. Symbols matter, right? Whether they're Confederate monuments hanging over your town or something else, the symbol matters. And that language of symbols, the cultural language of symbols, is precisely what's at stake when we think about the civic imagination. So I love the statue of George Washington, the first American president, from the Smithsonian Institute. And he's sitting there on Apollo's throne wearing sandals and a toga. And I lay odds the actual historical George Washington never wore either, which is why I call this cosplay George, right? He's cosplaying as someone from the classical world, or at least this is the way the artist imagined him, imagining the beginnings of the American government, the US Constitution, as a resurrection of classical democratic practices from ancient Greece and Rome, right? That's the imagery they're working from. And that imagery worked because it was the shared images of a generation that was educated at liberal arts schools like William and Mary and Harvard, where they learned classical Greek and Latin, and that was foundational for the rest of their education. So these symbols were immediate and important to them, and they are used widely in imagery around the American democracy. But today, the symbols that matter for your generation is coming from popular culture. So that's the same summer as George Floyd was killed. Like 2 weeks later, I attended online the Hermione Granger Leadership Academy, which was run by the Harry Potter Alliance and brought together young activists across a broad range of different social movements, particularly Black Lives Matter at that point, to talk about the future of young activism and to take best lessons from all of those movements and learn from each other. And one of the things that got talked about a lot there was sustainability and joy as important parts of a political movement. That if you are constantly being beaten down, how do you maintain the emotional resources to keep fighting for change? And fan activism was being held up because of its playfulness, because of its imaginativeness and creativity, because there's joy in one's relationship to K-pop and Harry Potter and all of that. It was being held up as an example of how one does that. How do you sustain it? How do you build joy into the political process, even if you're fighting for your very survival? And so that's the message I live with. That is maybe the ultimate thing that fan activism can teach other forms of activism at the present time. And with that, I will turn off the share screen and we can just talk.
Thank you very much for this very thought-provoking conference. We have some questions in the chat.
Oh, great.
So please feel free to type your questions. We don't have a lot of time. So if you have any, just put them right now. And I have a couple, but we can skip them if there are others. And you can put them either in Spanish or in English. En español o en inglés, y nosotros podemos hacer el esfuerzo de traducción. Entonces, por favor, si tienen preguntas, es el momento porque el doctor Jenkins se tiene que ir. Entonces, en 10 minutos. Entonces, si tienen alguna duda, pues es el momento. Okay, so we have one first here, which is from Simona Raquel. Could you consider the presence and influence of K-pop as a part of a geopolitical strategy?
Well, I think it's maybe multiple geopolitical strategies. One, of course, is the Korean government's effort to soft power, following the examples that are already demonstrated by Japan and India at using pop culture as a way of expanding its visibility and the visibility of its agenda worldwide. But there also is probably a fan agenda, right? That is maybe not totally aligned with the Korean government, which is about, say, changing forms of masculinity. It's no accident that, say, the Chinese government recently passed prohibitions on androgynous pop culture in its country as a way of regulating the access of the impact of Korean pop culture and its political agenda on China, right? So there's a cultural struggle between two nations, but it's being expressed through a language of gender politics and sexual politics, which is really what hits the fans most directly. So in that case, the fan agenda is being used as a surrogate for the national agenda, but the two can either work together or separately when we think about what K-pop means in a global marketplace.
Okay, and really linked to that, we have this Lily Takahashi's question. Can fandoms be considered subcultures, I guess, in the Headbitch sense, even when they're configured around a capitalist product, especially the BTS army?
Yeah, so let's start. I mean, what Headbitch tells us is that subcultures take symbols from the mother culture, and those symbols could be produced commercially. They could be the safety pin in the case of punks, or the Iron Cross in the case of the British punk movement. Both are commercially manufactured. Both have other uses for their parents. Putting a safety pin through your cheek, Headbitch tells us, is self-mutilation that's designed to get back at the mother who used the safety pin to protect the child from being penetrated, right? The Iron Cross is being used in the face of a generation that lived through the Blitz as a political symbol. But what Headbitch is suggesting is eventually those things get co-opted back into the capitalist system and become commodified. And we can think about the gold-plated safety pins that were suddenly on sale in Neiman Marcus, or Playboy did a Women of Punk pictorial of nudes of women of punk with mohawk pubics, right? So all of those symbols could be drawn back into the system. What he underestimated was the power of grassroots communication channels. So at one at the same time, we can think of social media platforms as themselves already commercialized, capitalized, data extractive, all the things critical studies would teach us about them, but it doesn't take away the fact that they are still effective means of communication, of connecting social movements together. And so when Black Lives Matter uses them, the hashtag is a way of demonstrating systemic problems. It is reclaiming from capital the power of communication. And so there's a constant back and forth struggle over these symbols today. And I would see fan activism as caught in both sides of that. Yes, as fans, we consume. I'll gladly give you some money to support the production of stories that matter to me. And I suspect minority groups are being, what was being described as compulsory fandom, is minority groups being forced to vote with their dollars to demonstrate support for cultural narratives where they are seen and heard. But I also want to own those symbols to tell my stories. And I refuse to bow to copyright police who might well want to shut me down in the name of protecting commercial interests. So this is not a simple thing. It's a really complex one. And I think it just adds an extra stage to Hebdige's model where co-optation is the endpoint. Co-optation is just part of the cycle of struggle over these symbols that is ongoing. I suspect that was true then too, but I think we now see it much more visibly through social media and memes and hashtags and so forth.
Okay, thank you very much. We have a couple of more questions. One from Francisco von Bülow. Can you identify any parallels between the symbolic activism of the anarchists of the 19th century and the present fan activism? Was Walter Benjamin already trying to talk about the potency of cultural participation? And then there's another one. What do you think is the main element that generates interest in activism for fans? I ask is because I think in Mexico, there's no such activism yet. And then a third one.
Okay.
Why, you didn't have to answer them all.
I'll do my best.
You have to be living. Why, in your opinion, people turn to symbols, imagery, and imaginary issue from specifically science fiction and fantasy? Most of your examples are from these genres to reshape the world. Why these genres? There's a specular image from our world in these fictions.
Okay, so first of all, I'm no expert on 19th century anarchist. I don't think I could really begin to answer that part of it particularly well, but I suspect you're onto something, and I would encourage you to bring your own research and expertise to bear on that question. Benjamin, I had used years ago in convergence culture to talk about memes. And I do think that this may be a different kind of power beyond, say, aura that Benjamin talks about, the work of art in the age of reproduction. It may return us to some of the themes of the storyteller that Benjamin talks about in The Storyteller, right? If the aura is used up by mass reproduction, resonance is expanded by it, right? And particularly by grassroots reproduction. So digital reproduction may expand the meanings that get attached to an image, even as the image becomes more domesticated and more readily available to us than the idea of aura. The aura of the Mona Lisa and the museum gives rise to the power of postcards with mustaches on Mona Lisa. Or I have a Catwoman cover from comics where the Catwoman cowl is on the Mona Lisa. All of those are examples of what I call resonance. And fan activism is all about resonance. In terms of there not being fan activism in Mexico, I'm no expert on Mexican culture, but I would say the lucha wrestlers have always generated a certain amount of social activism, which is very much fan activism, and as I understand it. And that's a starting point that I might look at, or lucha wrestlers and their followings and the ways they're mobilized locally for a variety of social causes. That's what I think it might look like there. But also I would look at those Birdman things, because most of those come from Mexico or other parts of Latin America. And there are lots of Birdman memes out there. And the final question about what happens, okay, let's see. So why do we turn to symbols, imagery from science fiction? Well, science fiction has been an activist space from its beginning. That's what Michael Saylor was talking about when he talked about public spheres of the imagination, was mostly the debates around science fiction. That just was an early stage, or one of the earliest forms of fan activism. And we could take that back even before the origins of the movement. To the tour, you know, there were Amateur Press Association is born in the 1850s in the US, and is the infrastructure that science fiction fandom would build on. The technocrat movement of the 1930s would be an early example of fan activism, but it is not the only one, right? I would say, want to find an early and somewhat negative example of fan activism, look at Birth of a Nation and the return of the Ku Klux Klan, especially the burning of the cross, which was not a Klan practice in the original Klan, was added because Dixon, who wrote the Klansman that Birth of a Nation is based on, knew Scottish history, took a Scottish ritual, added it to the Ku Klux Klan, and it became the weapon of power that the Klan was associated with across the 20th century. So that is not positive social change, but it is fan activism with a long history that is not dependent on science fiction or fantasy. I think we're just, insofar as Hollywood has so been dominated in recent years, the box office by superheroes and wizards and zombies and so forth, those become the political symbols of choice for this generation. Just as the imagery of the Black church and the book of Exodus was central for the Black civil rights movement of the 50s, where Martin Luther King talks about having gone to the mountaintop and seen the promised land and crossing the River Jordan and all kinds of imagery like that, all from the Bible. That's a different way of using the civic imagination. But he's doing the same thing as the Harry Potter Alliance or the BTS Army is, attaching some symbols from narratives that are bigger than life to the experiences and struggles of the current moment, to allow people to imagine a world where change is possible.
And I think we have to close, unfortunately. And so I'll leave Ariadna and the other question, the earlier greenwashing question, for another time. And only to thank Mr. Henry Jenkins and for all his will to participate with us, to come as often as you can. And really thank you so much for these enlightening and really thought-provoking ideas. And I think like many people are, I've been receiving messages from all other WhatsApp messages and other messages, just like to ask you to tell them how happy we are to have you here.
It has been great talking to you. And if anyone's got other questions, my email is hjenkins@usc.edu. So please send me email. Okay, and as Aranza's telling you, well, thank you. We are your phantom. Very nice. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, bye. And enjoy the essay. Yes. And keep you posted. Thank you so much for everyone. Bye.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.